Ok. Shalom, buenos días, buenas
Shalom,
tardes,
good
todos los
morning, good
horarios. Es
afternoon,
un gusto verlos,
wherever you are. It's a
um,
pleasure to see
ver a
you
muchos de
today, to
ustedes que
see
acabo
so
de
many
ver
of you who I
personalmente
just saw
y
in
otros ahora
person
en pantalla.
and see them,
Es
see
un
you
gusto
in
iniciar este nuevo
in
ciclo.
the session.
En
It's
esta
a pleasure to
ocasión
kick off this new cycle. And
he
on this
invitado
occasion, we
a
have
que un colega, Luis
invited a
Fleischman, que en este
colleague, Luis
momento aquí está
Fleischman,
con nosotros
who's
también,
here with us as
va
well,
a colaborar en la
to
coordinación de este
help
ciclo.
by
Me voy
coordinating
a presentar
this
ante
cycle.
ustedes
I'm going to
muy
introduce
brevemente
myself
ante todos
briefly.
aquellos que no me
For all of those who
conocen.
do not know
Mi
me,
nombre,
my
bueno,
name, of
claro,
course,
soy
is
Judit
Judith
Bokser-Liwerant.
Bokser-Liwerant.
Estoy en
I
México,
am based in
soy
Mexico, and I am
profesora emérita
a
distinguida en la
professor, the
Universidad
distinguished professor
Nacional
emeritus
Autónoma de
at
México
the
en el área de ciencias
UNAM, the
políticas, de ciencias
Autonomous University of
sociales.
Mexico, in
También soy
political science
investigadora
and social
nacional
science.
de
I'm
este
also
estatuto
a
y
researcher
mis
in the
dos
same
pasiones son, por un lado,
organization. And
las
my two
ciencias
passions are,
sociales,
on
la
the one
teoría
hand, social
social y
science and
política, y
social
por el
and,
otro
and
lado,
political
los
theory. And on
temas
the other
del
hand,
judaísmo
everything having to do
contemporáneo.
with contemporary
En
Judaism.
esto básicamente he canalizado
So
mis
that's what
esfuerzos,
I have devoted
investigación y
my
docencia.
efforts
Son ya muchas
to in
décadas y
research
dentro
and
de
teaching
esto,
over
un
several
eje
decades.
que he
And
trabajado
as
desde
part of this,
diferentes
one
perspectivas
aspect that
tiene
I
que
have
ver
worked
con
on
los
from different
procesos de
points of view
discriminación en
has to
general
do with
y
discrimination processes in
específicamente
general,
con
and
los
more
temas de
particularly
antisemitismo.
with anti-Semitism.
Y como veremos en un
And
momento
as
en
you'll
esta
hear
serie,
in a
con los
moment
temas
in the
de
series,
antisionismo y la interacción entre
anti-Zionism and
ellos
the
y
interaction
lo que
between those,
llamamos la crítica
and
de
what we
Israel,
call
¿correcto?
criticism
Entonces,
of Israel,
con el
right?
tiempo compartiré con
So
ustedes también con
I will be
materiales,
sharing
obviamente,
materials with you, of course,
datos
and data
sobre mí, pero
about,
por el
well,
momento
myself.
creo
That's
que es
what I
suficiente.
have to say
Y
for now, though.
entonces invito
And
a el
I would
doctor
like to
Luis
invite
Fleischman, que
Dr.
está aquí
Luis
con
Fleischman, who's
nosotros,
here with
que
us
también,
today
por
as well,
favor,
to please go
salude
ahead
a la
and
audiencia y se
greet the
presente de
audience
este
and
modo.
introduce himself.
Bueno, gracias, Judith, gracias.
Thank you, Judith.
Realmente
Thank
ha
you.
sido un placer
It's been
trabajar
a
contigo,
pleasure to
Judith,
work with
la
you,
coordinación
really,
de esto. Has hecho un
coordinating
trabajo
this
fenomenal. Voy a
series. You
aclarar
have
que
done
mayormente el
a
trabajo ha sido tuyo, Judith.
phenomenal work, and
Para mí
most
es
of
un
the work
placer
was done, of course,
realmente
by Judith.
estar
Let
con
me
todos.
clarify that. And
Tenemos
it's a pleasure for me to be with all
muchísimos
of you.
muy
Here
buenos
we have
oradores en las próximas
very good
semanas.
speakers
Me
lined up for the
presento.
next few weeks. And let me introduce
Yo soy
myself.
actualmente
I am
profesor de sociología
currently
en
a
Palm Beach State
professor of
College.
sociology at the
Llegué a la
Palm Beach State
academia
College.
con tiempo
I
completo
entered
solamente en los
academia.
últimos
I
8
became a
años,
full-time
después de
academic
haber
only eight
tenido una
years
carrera
ago
en la Federación de
after
Judíos
having a
Norteamérica
career with the
por
North
casi
American
28 años.
Jewish Federations
Trabajé
for
en
almost
el
20
condado de
years.
Palm
I
Beach,
worked with, at
Florida,
the
y también
in the county of Palm
en
Beach
Central New
in Florida
Jersey
and in
como
central New
vicepresidente
Jersey
y
as
director
vice
ejecutivo
president
de
and
Relaciones
executive
Comunitarias
director
y Políticas.
for community and
En esa
political
capacidad
relations.
trabajé
In that
intensamente en
capacity, I
asuntos
worked
relacionados con Medio Oriente
intensely
y seguridad
in
nacional y
matters
serví como
pertaining
enlace
to the Middle
entre
East and national security. And I was
estas
also a
organizaciones donde yo
liaison
trabajé, las
between these
federaciones y el
organizations,
sistema
the
de gobierno
federations, and the
local y
local
federal, y
and
también con
federal
diplomáticos
governments,
extranjeros.
as well as
También
foreign
hice lo que se
diplomats.
llama
I
relaciones intergrupales e
also
interreligiosas.
devoted myself to
También
intergroup
trabajé
and
como
interreligious
part-time
relations. I
en
also
tiempo
worked
parcial para el
part-time
proyecto de seguridad
with
hemisférica
the
del
hemispheric
Mendes, del Centro
security project
Mendes, para el
of
centro,
the
perdón, para el Center for Security Policy
Center
en
for
Washington,
Security Policy in
centrándome
Washington, D.C.,
principalmente en América Latina y sus
working
desafíos a la
basically with Latin
democracia,
America
la
and
estabilidad
its
regional y la seguridad
challenges for
nacional de Estados Unidos.
democracy,
Soy el
regional
autor de dos
stability,
libros, El
and
enigma del Medio
U.S.
Oriente,
security. I
conflicto
am the author of
palestino-israelí a la
two
luz de cambios
books,
sociales,
one about
y
the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the light of social
Latinoamérica en
conflicts,
la era
and Latin
post-Chávez.
America in the post-Chavez era.
Ambos libros fueron
Both
escritos en
books
inglés,
were
no
written
traducidos al
originally
español.
in English and
Fui
translated into
también
Spanish.
miembro del equipo
I was also a
asesores de
member
política
of the
exterior en la
team
campaña del
of
candidato
foreign
presidencial
policy advisor
Mitt Romney
of
en el año
Mitt
2012.
Romney in his
Particularmente
2012
enfocándome en
campaign
América
as a
Latina, pero
presidential
también en
candidate,
Oriente
focusing
Medio.
mainly on Latin America, but also on the Middle East.
Bueno, sin
So,
más,
without
Judith,
further ado, Judith,
Muy
la
bien,
over
palabra es
to
tuya.
you. Over to you.
muy bien, muy bien.
Excellent.
Debo
I
confesar que a
must
lo mejor
confess that
erróneamente,
maybe
pero
by mistake,
presumí yo que
I assumed
algunas de las cosas que he
that
hecho
some
las di
of the
por
things that I
supuesto,
have done
pero creo que
um,
es importante que durante
are
este ciclo nos
known by
vayamos
all, but it's
conociendo
important
más.
for us to get to know each other throughout this cycle.
Bueno,
So, with
pensé
that,
que antes de lleno
I
entrar
thought
en
that before going
nuestras
into our
sesiones,
session proper,
era una
it would
obligación
be
presentar ante ustedes
mm,
el por qué y cómo
important for
del
me
nombre
to
de este
tell you
ciclo,
about the
donde tenemos
why and
referencia
how
tanto
of the
a
name of this
el
cycle, which
concepto de
refers to constellations
correcto,
as a
como
concept
el de
and that
avatares,
of
¿no? Y
avatars.
entonces pensé
So
que valía
I
la pena
thought that it would be
que hiciéramos
worthwhile
una reflexión,
to
compartirla con ustedes
share
antes de
some
ir
thoughts with you
ya de hecho de
about
lleno
that
dentro de
before
nuestra
diving
presentación.
into
Yo
my
diría que en
presentation
el
itself.
amplio terreno
I
de las
believe
ciencias
that in the
sociales,
vast field
la
of social
noción de
sciences, the notion
constelación
of constellation
ofrece una poderosa
offers a
metáfora.
powerful
Sí,
metaphor,
la utilizo,
and that's how I use it,
o la utilizamos
or
para
we use it
comprender
to understand
realidades complejas
complex
en las que se
realities
entrelazan
where
instituciones,
institutions,
actores, discursos
stakeholders,
y también
discourses, and
relaciones
power
de poder.
relations are
A
intertwined.
diferencia de una estructura
Unlike a
rígida,
rigid
el
structure,
concepto de una
the
constelación
concept of
es más bien un
constellation
patrón
is
dinámico
actually a dynamic
y en
pattern,
este sentido
and
surge
as
el
such,
resultado de
it emerges
interacciones y
from the
tensiones
interactions and
entre los elementos
tensions
que lo
between
componen.
its components.
Y lo que me es muy importante
And
destacar,
it is
hay
important to
una
underline
referencia
that
tanto a la
there is
continuidad como al
reference to
cambio,
continuity and
a la
change,
estabilidad
to
como a la
stability and
transformación.
transformation. They all coexist.
Creo que este
I
enfoque
believe that
que
this approach
nosotros adoptamos para
that we're
acercarnos al
taking
tema del
to the issue
antisemitismo
of
nos
anti-Semitism
permite analizar
allows
tanto sus múltiples
for a
dimensiones como sus
multidimensional
múltiples
and
causas
multi-causal
en este
causal
sentido, nuestros hechos
analysis
culturales,
involving
sociales,
cultural,
los procesos
social processes,
políticos,
political
todos ellos
processes.
están viendo
All
de
of
modo,
them
diríamos, relacional,
are
interactuando
interrelated, they
y
interact,
también desplegándose en la historia.
and also
Así,
play out
diríamos
throughout
que en el
history.
caso que nosotros
So,
vamos a estar trabajando,
in
como es
this
antisemitismo y formas
series
relacionadas
about
de
anti-Semitism
odio,
and
de
related forms
discriminación,
of
de
hatred,
rechazo, tiene que ver
discrimination,
con
and
la
rejection,
posibilidad de un
what we
mapeo
have is
de
the
cuáles también son las
chance to
posiciones de
map
los actores,
the positions
cuáles los
of
significados
stakeholders,
que le
the
atribuyen a sus
meanings
propias acciones
attributed to
en
their
las
own
imágenes de
actions,
odio.
and the
Entonces,
images of hate.
creo que lo que
In
estamos
that
viendo
regard, I
es
believe
que
that what
esta
we're
perspectiva
witnessing is
reconoce
that
que
this
la realidad social, en
approach
este caso
recognizes that
concreto, la
social
realidad del
reality in this
antisemitismo y de las
specific case,
formas,
and I'm talking about
están en
anti-Semitism
permanente
and other forms of hate,
recomposición. Los
are in
elementos se reagrupan
constant
y se redefinen.
recomposition.
Y eso
Elements
no
are
quiere decir,
regrouped
como
and
también
redefined
tendremos
over time.
posibilidad de
And of
ver,
course, as
que
we'll
son
see
siempre los mismos.
from now on,
Hay
this does
aquellos
not
que
mean that they do
persisten
not
y
remain the
otros
same.
luego
Some
disisten.
persist and some new
¿Y
ones
por qué utilizar el
join
concepto
the
de
group.
avatar?
And why
Que
should we
también
use the
es un
concept of
importante.
avatar, which is
Bueno,
also
es
a
una
metaphor?
dimensión interesante
This is
para
an interesting
pensar
dimension for
tanto la
us to think
representación
about
como la
the
proyección
representation
de
and
lo que podríamos
projection
llamar
of what we might
entramados
denominate
simbólicos, esto es,
symbolic
percepciones, imágenes,
weavings.
representaciones,
These are
conceptos de
images,
cómo vemos al otro.
representations, and
En
concepts
este
of how we
sentido, los
see the other.
avatares
In this
funcionan
sense,
como
avatars work
una mediación
as
que nos
mediations
permite traer,
that
condensar
condense
narrativas
narratives
images,
tropes,
and
ways in which the other's representation is built, right? Also, avatars mean that there are disputes involving stakeholders, groups, cultures, and subcultures. There are disputes around meanings, where these symbolic capitals or this symbolic capital circulates in society, or the negative images that we will talk about Jews and Jewishness, as well as the Jewish national movement, Zionism. So we will delve deep into discourse and images, as well as identities. So we have before us a universe of constellations and a universe of avatars. And at this point, with this in mind, I would like to share with you a PowerPoint presentation with certain graphic representations, where we'll see certain aspects to support my presentation and many of the presentations that will be heard throughout the cycle. Let me say that before we start, that I would like to thank and acknowledge those of you who joined our efforts to intensely disseminate information about and publicize this cycle, because we had serious problems with dissemination, and up until a few days ago, it was the best kept secret that we were launching the cycle. So I'd like to thank all of you here, Professor Margalit Bejerano, who from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem immediately shared this with the members of EMILAT, which is the group of Latin American researchers, and also shared it with the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. Romina Yalonowski, who's also here with us, and she will be one of our speakers. And of course, I will not name everyone. Oh, that was beautiful to see. I love that heart, yeah, Romina. You see a heart going up my screen. So all of you who are joining forces with us, thank you. Let's do something that is worth our while, worth the effort for a joint reflection to happen. So let me share my screen with you, and I'll do that in a second. Let us get started. I need to just click on a few things, and we'll be right back with you and get started. So here it is, constellations and avatars. But most importantly, we want to look at the convergences and divergences at such a difficult juncture as the one that we are experiencing. So first of all, if I may, I'd like to tell you that if we draw a line of continuity between our concerns, I believe that one of the issues that is under discussion currently is whether since October 7th, and let me go straight into the last point here in my timeline, which is here at the bottom of the slide, as you can see. Since then, the existence of prejudices that have been accumulating led to a very intense eruption in October 7th and the Gaza war, which is at the bottom of the screen of this first slide. led to the recovery of some previous moments in time and trends that supported the development of what we would denominate an accumulation of attitudes and images which had been latent. Latent, by latent, I mean that they were maybe dormant, not active, undiscovered, or unrevealed, but which seem to be at the ready to express themselves covertly. And the discourses and those practices that come with this very intense eruption involve the revival and rekindling of prior moments around which an image, a representation, and a symbolic field were built.
Me permito, ahí está.
One of the questions that crops up here is, as a process of discrimination that is built, anti-Semitism also arises as a diffuse process, which is both objective and subjective at the same time. It's also cultural in nature and material. It's individual and collective at the same time. And it's two-dimensional. There are two dimensions that we're witnessing now at the current time. Those have to do with the impact of these images. One of them is indirect, which might be discursive, meaning how negative images concerning the other, the Jew, impact individuals, groups, civil society, and public opinion. And the direct dimension has to do with discriminatory policies, practices, and actions. And there is something else that is worth mentioning in this area. When we talk about a subjective phenomenon when referring to anti-Semitism, we're referring to stereotypes, myths, and attitudes. But not only that, we must also talk about behaviors. What are the practical actions and the systems that allow for this to happen? So here I would like to revisit the idea that we'll see how anti-Semitism, and we'll talk about anti-Zionism as well, and criticism of Israel that overflows and turns into both, is produced and reproduced in discourse. And this discursive production and reproduction is also leading to impacts. Latin America, for those of us who have devoted ourselves to the study of the region, this is known. There are different, has witnessed anti-Semitism over time. And this is a fundamental characteristic or feature of Latin America, starting from the conquest, the Inquisition, nation building, the quest for national integration, the development of ethnicities and how they take on a political aspect, and also the efforts made to achieve and build modernity. And as we saw recently at a meeting in Jerusalem, we see that modernity in Latin America has led to the possibility of having multiple expressions of modernity and also failures, quite frankly, and so on and so forth. And this image that we will share with you later, you can see that there are different points in time when there have been expressions of rejection, hate, and images that have accumulated negatively. And let me just say briefly that we are currently looking at what the place is for these expressions within violent cultures. And we're talking about recurring crises of political, social, and economic nature. And there is a redefinition of the region and how it is inserted in globality, and also recurring crises of the democracy and disintegrating democracies, and also the link between these. And instead of populism, what's the place of populism and populisms, and the building of a homogeneous people that may lead to the exclusion of those who do not belong to this people as conceived. At this point, I believe that we're not in a position to stop and delve deeper into this, historically speaking. But what is worth mentioning is that we're currently faced with a cumulative process that is rekindling images, as we'll see at some point, images of the other, and that is transmitted, as I said, conveyed through discourse, through transmission chains, and what we see are images, mainly metaphors, which make this rejection of the other objective. And here is the first example in this flowchart, where we see, just a second, I am just fixing my screen here. We can see how there are different tropes, such as world domination by the Jews, the deicide people, the people behind a global conspiracy, money lovers, wealthy, powerful, immoral, others. They are outsiders, lobbyists also, as yet another element that have saying that claiming that we have an impact on policy around the world, people with a different racial character, also Israel and Zionism becomes the matrix, the origin of both for the West and for colonialism, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, and also Israel seen as an apartheid and genocidal state. And these tropes, these negative images, in turn, are interrelated very interestingly with what we call topes, broad or topos, so social and political constellations, imperialism, Zionism, colonialism, and racism appear as these bodies which will allow for these images to proliferate within them. So I'll keep going. My computer is acting up on me. It's not allowing me to move forward. Let's see if I can do something about it. Apparently, it's not easy to do. Somebody can tell her that she should click on the arrow on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. It's frozen. So I will have to stop using my presentation. Oh, apparently now it's working. So what I just showed you, these overarching negative elements, are the consequence of how in Latin America there are two sets. One, there's the historical development in Mexico, and then there's the case in Argentina. First of all, and here we're talking about Mexico, what you can see here is, and this refers to the 1930s and 40s, as you may remember from the first slide, that's where the major discussion emerged, which goes from the beginning of immigration policies up until the integration of Jews at the national level, and that spans the 1930s and 40s, basically, where there is major effervescence in terms of antagonistic stances. And so, regardless of official policies, there was a great deal of agreement in terms of negative arguments being made by members of the government and also anti-Semitic groups and what is called the intellectual right. So what we see up on the screen now is a disaggregation of what I just showed you in the previous slide, centralized. So there's a distinctive racial character. They do not assimilate. There's this whole discussion about around immigration, that they are loan sharks, that they are idle money lenders and money lovers, etc. And so this permeates different sectors and swaths of the population. Now, in Argentina, and here we're talking about the 50s and 60s as well, what we'll see is that even before that, we see elements where they're considered undesirable foreigners and conspiracy theories, dual loyalty, servants of Israel, and also another argument which is very popular, an anti-Zionist argument, basically incentivized in the 60s by Adolf Eichmann's trial. Now, if we press on, one very important point that emerges in relation to today's constellations is that there is this equation between Zionism and racism and the regionalization of the conflict. So what we're talking about, the resolution, the UN resolution 3379, which equates Zionism to racism. So this triangle of Zionism, Jews, and Israel becomes connected in terms of sense and significance. So what I'd like to underscore here is this connection of meaning. It's not necessarily the same argument, but what it is doing is to create these links and associations in people's minds. What I'd like to bring to the fore here is the equation victimizer equation, genocide, perpetrators of the Nazi Holocaust, and the manipulation of the memory of the Holocaust. And we're in the 1970s. Actually, the first accusation leveled at Israel as a genocidal state dates back to the 1970s as part of the Soviet propaganda, which was exacerbated with the 60-day war, which must be brought up here and will later be linked to how in the 1960s, especially 1967, and with the Six-Day War, there will be a fundamental link established between the 68, the crisis constellations involving student movements. So if I clearly highlighted that in black, as you can see, so I went, I slid from the left to the right in this case, based on how this is laid out. And there are certain arguments that do not cancel out prior arguments, but rather start to supersede them in terms of priorities. So victim, victimizer, manipulation of the memory of the Holocaust, and perpetrators of the Nazi Holocaust. And from here, let us go to the core of what we're seeing now in greater dimension. So the Jew as manipulator of his or her own history. And as Jews emphasizing the suffering of the, at least in Latin America and in the media. Lately, every single reference to what happened on October 7th, or any reference to the thousands of dead and injured, is brought into question, is challenged, especially in social media, as manipulation of suffering. Secondly, Israel allegedly doing to the Palestinians what Hitler did to the Jews, and I just said that, so that's also another line of argumentation, and Israel as the perpetrator of a new Holocaust, and the Holocaust, a mass, became the most publicized mass crime in human history. So what they're doing is challenging the fact that the way Jewish memory was started to assimilate and have its own history sink in. So very briefly, I'd like to say that my proposal is that anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and criticism of Israel are processes that are different. They may have different motives in terms of cultural configuration and underlying interests. And as I was saying, the strategic constellation. Is it Latin America, Europe, the United States? But there are convergences as well, nonetheless. So what we're seeing basically is that in spite of the differences, in terms of construction of meaning, there are major convergences. So one leads to the other and attracts the other. It's difficult to imagine criticism leveled at Israel for existing that is completely divorced from criticism leveled at Jewish memory itself, or at the negative images, old and new, as well as attitudes and behaviors. And the riskiest thing we see is that this has led to the situation that we're witnessing today as a consequence of decades over which this was developed. And I'm talking about the normalization of hostility, the radicalization of anti-postures or stances. Delegitimization are all elements which emerge as potential results, combining criticism of Israel when it goes beyond criticism of government policy or state policy and overflows into concepts and tropes that just demonize leaders, demonize a government, And regardless of whether certain criticism of policies is justified or not. And we're all aware, I believe, of the fact that this is a situation we're faced with at this moment. And let me say that what we're seeing is that what began as an ideological package of sorts, or rather, let me use a very fortunate expression from Shulamit Volkov, a researcher, who speaks of cultural codes. There are myths, mobilizing myths, where reference number one leads to other myths. For example, anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism demand as cultural codes that there be anti-Zionist stances. So they go hand in hand, anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, and anti-Zionism. And this emerged as a cultural code and became a transnational ideological package. What we're seeing today is actually regional and global coordination of these procedures and criticism. I am going to skip ahead because time is of the essence, and let me go straight into what seems to be dimensions of action and discourse today. Let me say that what is manifest and what is anonymous, what is global and regional at this time, and since and between October 7th and the Gaza war has taken on the shape or has become a culture. It went from being a cultural code, from being criticism leveled at a government, at an ideology, at a state, to becoming a transnational package. And we see that on the streets, university campus, and social media. And that's the connection between meetings and how the various levels overlap. So let me just say, and this is an interesting, very interesting exercise in terms of public policy. Let us take a look at the shared aspects in geopolitical terms and how Latin America has lent its support to the Ukraine and Russia, and then support for Israel and Hamas. So we're talking about a geopolitical change that we're experiencing that has led to partnerships that express fundamental stances. So what is the regional constellation in Latin America? This also stems from the various points in time where public power, governments, regimes experienced different junctures, such as the first pink tide, the conservative wave, and then the resurgence of the pink tide. And one of the major issues that we see in Latin America, I'm looking at it from the top down, basically from the government's standpoint, is that there are meaning related connections in terms of political stances. So the example par excellence is here in Mexico. Let's take a look at the situation in Mexico and the images with which, since October 7th, there is dissemination, and since October 7th, what we see is a connection throughout Latin America. But not only in Latin America, these are images from Mexico, Argentina, and here we're talking about situations where that we see out on the streets, but also at university campuses. Here, these are pictures of Chile, Colombia, And all of these images are basically the same: Uruguay, Guatemala, Venezuela. And as I said recently, they were all produced in print shops in Chile. And this is a public statement on October 8th, not October 7th, where immediately what we see is an attack against Israel as part of the beginning of a movement of liberation, the end of apartheid, and the possibility to put an end to the genocidal history of Israel. And we're talking about October 8th. These were federations of Argentina-Palestinian associations, and these are several European associations and organizations as well. And here we're talking about the massacre underway in the Gaza Strip, and also accusations of genocide, Zionism, Israel. This has intensified over time. And if I may, let me direct your attention to the fact that it looks like, and I think this is of the essence, that the connection that I mentioned about the Six-Day War, the Vietnam War, the student movement, and minority rights movement have been cumulative. And this is seen currently in the expressions that we are now witnessing. So this pro-Palestine mobilization goes beyond, and I might not be rigorous enough in saying this, but without a doubt, sympathy for the Palestinian people is something that we're not bringing into question. I mean, it's that they're not the privilege of terrorist groups proper, but rather the fact that the monopoly of this defense was taken over when Free Palestine means more often than not the non-existence of the State of Israel emerges as a very harsh situation and one that is very striking. So there are 2 points that I have no time to go into, but that I would like to mention briefly. And they're the following. One of the topics that I've been researching lately has to do with what the role is for academia and for different theories, because the landscape, academic landscape, and this is an expression borrowed from a very well-known anthropologist, landscape, shows that there has been a fight for the hegemony and for heading theoretical corpuses who no longer see the Jew as an expansion of the West, but rather as the cause. It's not the other in the West, but the West itself. And this has to do with all post-colonial and decolonial theories that we'll talk about throughout our series. And in the interest of time, I would like to wrap up in a minute, and we're going to ask our co-organizers to please give us a few more minutes for this session. But just as I mentioned that there are expressions out on the streets, university campuses have become a privileged space for reconstruction and reproduction of discourse. And there's the issue of social media, the internet, and hate speech based on anonymity immediacy and the global nature of this kind of connection. It's a very inexpensive and unhindered network, and that's what Perry and Olson said, and quite rightly so, which allows fragmented groups to connect, creating a collective identity and a sense of community. What they call actually a global racist subculture. So I believe that this is something that is happening, and that also explains this overwhelming presence of groups of young people. So the importance of language, the creation of tropes, and this image, because the language establishes, maintains, lends legitimacy or changes reality, and it's the main medium or means for us to create the psychological distance or distancing and this otherness. And it's fundamental for us to say that anti-Semitism in social media has become one of the core channels for it. The Web Discrimination Observatory analyzed Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Venezuela, and the importance of the significance of anti-Semitism in all of them. This anti-Semitism involves basically the state of Israel at this point in time, the Gaza war, and the other features that I pointed out. This is very important. The percentage of the population in Latin America using social media is extremely high when compared to the percentage of the population that uses other media. So at the top of the screen, what we see is that we see 75%, and these data are from April of this year, by the way. So I suppose they remain correct, or at least the trend is actually upward. So at this point, I would like to come back to you. I'd like to come back to you. I'll close my presentation, and I'd like to say that I believe that now we are faced with a juncture that we will have the possibility, the opportunity to talk about from different standpoints and about different aspects that I have just presented to you briefly and in general today. It has to do with government policy, with civil society and spaces, images and actions, and a host of processes that will or can allow us to approach in a more accurate and clarifying manner, if I may say, to what we currently see as avatars, these representations. And before I open the floor for a Q&A and comment session, I would like to say that this effect, the thresholds of acceptance of rejection and prejudice, emerge as a very worrisome piece of information. And secondly, when those thresholds for acceptance become lower and lower, without a question, prejudice circulates at all levels, in the media, in academia, on the streets, within associations of all kinds, professional associations, and maybe even labor unions. And they are, of course, connected to the conflicts experienced by society at a certain juncture. So this global mobilization, or at least in Latin America, but not only here, in the United States as well, in Europe, I believe that regional is also global when it comes to this. This happens, and here, what we are seeking is a way to express this and shared sentiment as well. I believe that there are negative images involving what we're seeing now. I don't know whether you've been paying attention to it, but at any rate, I don't know why. Hopefully, not everybody has access to that. So that's what I had for you, and I'd like to now open the floor for comments. Luis, I wonder whether you'd like to say something. We also have several other speakers here, Sergio de la Pérgola, Romina, Luis Roninger. I would like to now invite you to take a few minutes and actually share and exchange some opinions. Gabriela, I see you as well from Buenos Aires. It's nice to see you. So here we are. I have a question. I'd like to hear more about this connection that I feel is quite revealing between protests in May 1968 and in general, and these student movements, and this comeback, this revival that we're seeing now. I hadn't seen it that way. So what are the similarities that you have found? Could you please elaborate on that link, please? Certainly, of course. This is quite broad. And I'm looking, I'm researching this. So the 68, and I can actually share two texts with you here. One is called The 68, the 68s around the world. For the first time, I was struck to see that what began in the United States as an avant-garde movement, which is the rights of minorities, is connected to look which way I'm going. There is a link, and there are several very good papers about this. There's a link between all of the African American claims and the ties to Palestinian groups. So there are two PhD theses about this, which are very interesting, about the spatial nature of this alliance between African American minorities and Palestinian groups or pro-Palestinian groups. So that's one line. And the second line has to do with anti-Semitic acts, as part of this wonderful effervescence of the 68s. So in terms of leadership, we have the case of France, and we've seen recent interviews with some of the leaders where that element was already seen, that was post-67. In extreme cases, Poland, for example, the expulsion of all Jews. So as part of the memory of the 68s, the 68s were the installment of the installation of a new ideology, revolutionary change, a new worldview, and that's of course linked to the rejection of the Vietnam War and how it mobilized everyone. So I think we're experiencing that again. Maybe in general terms, I would say that now the Jew is no longer the victim and has the right, the legitimate right to say, has no longer the legitimate right to say and to claim that the Jew was a victim of genocide. The victim par excellence is, and victimhood par excellence is claimed by the Palestinian people. So the same thing happened here. We're talking about the representation of the anti-power, the possibility of the weak vis-a-vis the strong, and these decolonization processes. So I believe that we have very many elements to be able to see today this similarity, and it's again on the campus, and the subject is the student. And I'm just moving through this very fast. The new left and this rejection of nationalisms, but now there's no rejection to the Palestinian claim for national identity. So I think that we have to be very careful when talking about this. I do not want to gloss over this, but I believe that we have the elements available to us to draw this comparison and find these similarities. Judith, I would like to add a comment, if I may. Yes, go ahead.
No, pero sí, o sea, quiero ver si también hay
I'd like to
preguntas,
see
pero
whether there are more questions first.
hay un elemento
But
acá
there
que
is an element at play
es
here,
verdad, o sea, todo
which
lo
is
que tú
true.
dijiste, viste
Everything you said,
cómo el tema
and you
palestino se
talked about
conecta
how the
con
Palestinian
otro tipo de
issue
ideologías
connects to
regionales,
other
el
regional
imperialismo, otras más
ideologies,
globales, colonialismo, imperialismo,
anti-imperialism,
racismo,
anti-colonialism,
esto que sé,
racism,
inigualdad, lo que... Pero por otro
inequality,
lado, tenemos también, por
uh,
ejemplo,
you name it. But
paralelamente a conflictos
we
como
also,
el de Gaza, tenemos otros
at the same
conflictos, o sea,
time as
por ejemplo,
conflicts such as that
lo
of
que
the
ha sucedido con los
The
cristianos en
Gaza
Nigeria
conflict, we have other conflicts.
o
What's
la
happening to
invasión
Christians in
rusa a
Nigeria or the
Ucrania,
Russian
realmente
invasion of
ahí sí
Ukraine.
ha habido masacres
And there have been
crueles.
cruel massacres that have
Sin
taken place
embargo,
there.
es el conflicto en Gaza el
But
que
the Gaza
sobresale,
conflict
¿verdad?
is what stands out, right?
Aquí hay un elemento
So,
en los movimientos sociales que se
in
llama
social
resource
movements,
mobilization,
there's something
que es
called
el tema
resource
de acá hay
mobilization,
también algo organizado
meaning that
detrás y algo que se
is
ha
there
venido
something organized
organizando desde
behind
hace
this,
mucho tiempo.
and something that has
Dinero que
been
va hacia las
in the
universidades,
making for a
dinero
long
que
time,
va hacia
money
grupos
flowing into
disidentes.
universities, into dissident
Qatar se
groups.
dice que está detrás de esto.
Qatar
Yo
is
creo que
purportedly
sin
behind
este
this.
elemento
It is said
organizativo
that
y
they're
de
behind us. So
recursos,
without this element, these
hubiese sido
resources,
difícil
these organizational elements,
reproducir
it
esto
would have
como
been
un
difficult
momento
to
así,
reproduce this
como se reprodujo.
in the way that it has been.
Y particularmente lo vimos porque otros
Especially,
conflictos han sido
and
ignorados.
we see this because other
Pero
conflicts
estoy
have been
100% de
ignored.
acuerdo con todo lo que
But
tú
I
dijiste.
fully agree with everything you said. All right. I think that your comment is completely true. I believe that when we talk of a transnational package, this is the type, this is what we mean. We're talking about this type of coordination without a doubt. And we are witnessing this. So when I said it was nothing new, that's what I meant. It's been underway for a long time. At today's session, as I said, in today's session, I just mentioned that some criticism is legitimate. And before I even began, I was actually making a comment, and I said, Israel's domestic logic and objective security seen from the outside may have different dynamics, but there is a concern at play here. Yes. We have a couple more minutes. Sergio de la Pérgola. Greetings.
Hay un comentario en el chat también.
There's a comment in the chat as well.
Hay un comentario en el
There's a
chat
comment
también, si
in the
querés
chat
referirte a eso.
by Juan Pablo Neira. Let me check. So it says,
Bueno, sí,
All
hay
right.
esta
Yes.
autoadscripción
There's
de
this
quienes están
self-adscription
trabajando por,
by those
vamos a
who
decir, la
work
identificación con la causa palestina, también
for
que
the
tengan
Palestinian
alguna
cause and
aura
identify with the
revolucionaria de
Palestinian
luchar,
cause. They see themselves as
eh,
revolutionaries, as
y es el mismo
fighters,
perfil psicológico
and
del
it's the
antiimperialismo,
same psychological
anticapitalismo.
profile
No hay
as
duda, no hay
anti-imperialism
duda.
and,
Yo
and
quisiera decir un
anti-capitalism.
elemento
You're absolutely
muy,
right.
muy local, tal vez,
There's a very
pero
local
nosotros
element,
aquí
maybe,
hemos tenido,
but we,
local quiere decir, pues lo
by
estamos viviendo
local, I
aquí,
mean
pero
we're
está siendo
experiencing
vivido
it
en otros
here, but
lugares,
also elsewhere.
demandas que tienen un
So
argumento
these are
progresista,
demands with a
siempre
progressive
relacionadas con eso,
argument
de ruptura de diplomático con
demanding
las universidades
the
israelíes, etcétera, o
breaking
bien
of
la
diplomatic
exclusión
relations
de
with Israel
profesores
or
de
academic
claustros.
relations, or
Son
also
demandas
excluding
tremendamente
professors
fascistas,
from the
porque
faculty.
esos son,
These
o
are
sea,
absolutely
que atentan contra la
fascist
libertad de
as their
cátedra,
demands,
libertad de
because it
expresión,
is
etcétera,
an assault on freedom of
pero bueno,
expression.
la autoadscripción es que son
But
movimientos
they see
progresistas,
themselves
¿no es
as
cierto?
progressive
Esto
movements.
estamos de acuerdo.
That's true.
¿Hasta qué punto la llegada del discurso
Up
pro-palestino en
until
Colombia
what
está
point the
vinculado con
arrival
el
of
auge
the
de la inversión árabe
pro-Palestinian
y la eventual
discourse in
presencia de
Colombia
Hezbollah
is
en el
tied
territorio
to
nacional?
the height of
Bueno, vimos el
Arab
presidente
investment
pronunciando
and the
frases
possible presence of Hezbollah
Miren,
in the country. And we see
sin
we
lugar a
heard
duda,
the
creo que los
president
nexos se dan. ¿Qué
actually
es lo que
saying
lleva?
saying a few words in
Voy a decir
Arabic.
algo que es a
Well,
manera de
I'm going to
hipótesis.
say this, which is
Todos
hypothetical,
hemos
but
leído
we have
de
all
un
read
intento
that there was
de
an
ataque
attempt
a la embajadora
to
de Israel en
attack
México,
the
¿correcto? Creo
ambassador,
que
the
esta,
Israeli ambassador
esta
in Mexico,
noticia
right? We all
trascendió.
know about this.
Esta noticia
We all read about this in the
señala
news,
donde
and
tanto fuerzas de Estados
according to the
Unidos, de
news item,
inteligencia como de
both
Israel y de México, los
intelligence
tres
forces from
colaboraron
Israel and the United
ejecutar
States and
este
Mexico worked
atentado se llevara a
together
cabo.
to foil
Frente a
this
esta
attack.
noticia tan fuerte,
And
donde está implicado
faced with this very
una colaboración
striking
de
piece
los
of
tres,
news, which
y está implicado la
implies
acusación a Venezuela e Irán,
cooperation between all
correcto,
three, and also there's an
el
implicit
gobierno de
accusation
México
leveled at Venezuela and Iran.
niega que
The
haya habido
Mexican government
tal
just denied
colaboración o tal
the
noticia.
fact that
Bueno,
that happened and that
creo
there was
que
any type of
evidentemente para el gobierno de
collaboration.
México
Of
en este
course, the
momento sus
Mexican
lealtades
government
son
has its own
Nicaragua,
loyalties. They lie
Venezuela,
with Nicaragua,
inclusive me extendería a
Venezuela, and
Irán, sin
even
lugar a duda.
Iran, I
Es
dare
un
say, and
elemento que
the
no
Arab
podemos
world
perder de
is
vista.
something that we cannot
Entonces,
overlook.
la pregunta en torno a
So
Colombia
the question about
me
Colombia
parece adecuada.
seems pertinent to me.
¿Hay alguien más que quisiera tomar la palabra?
Anybody else would like to say something?
Judith,
Em,
solo a modo de
Judith,
reflexión, si
if
me
I
lo
may, by
permite, me
way of
pregunto
reflection,
cuando
I
estamos
wonder,
pensando, como Luis nos dice, en
when we're
términos de
thinking,
resource
as
mobilization,
Luis
el
was saying,
momento
in terms
común,
of
¿qué hubiera pasado
resource mobilization,
si
I
el 7
wonder
de
for a moment
octubre
what would have
hubiera
happened
acontecido
if
con un
October
contexto de
7th had
gobierno
happened in the
diferente en
context of
Israel,
a
con unas
different government
respuestas
in Israel
diferentes de lo que
with
se acabó
a
después
different
la
response,
guerra en Gaza?
not
Si en
the
términos de
exacerbation of the war
antisemitismo
in
y
Gaza. But
antisionismo,
in
¿tú
terms of
crees que nos
anti-Semitism and
veríamos hoy
anti-Zionism, do you
plantados en la
think
misma situación en la
today
que
we would
estamos?
be in the same situation that we find ourselves?
Es una pregunta difícil,
That's a
mi querida
difficult
Perla.
question, my dear
Muy
Perla.
difícil, es muy
Very
buena,
difficult.
pero es
It's an
muy
excellent
difícil.
question, but very
Yo
difficult
creo
to answer.
que,
I believe
yo creo que sin lugar a duda
that
hay acción y
without a
reacción.
question, there's always action and
Y
reaction.
creo que la
And I
respuesta,
think that the answer,
la magnitud de la
the
destrucción en
magnitude
Gaza,
of
la
destruction in
concepción
Gaza,
política que ha
the
tenido el gobierno
political
israelí, ellos son elementos que impactan,
conception
pero también
seen by the
creo
Israeli
hay
government, exhibited by the
una
Israeli government, do
lógica
have an impact, of
con
course.
relativos
But there's
grados de
this
autonomía
logic
en lo que
that
tendría que
is
ver con
relatively
posturas
independent in terms
antisionistas
of
y
anti-Zionist
antisemitas.
positions and
Creo que
anti-Semitic
estos
positions. I believe that both situations are feasible and should be taken into account. I believe that the impact of the Israeli policy is not nil, and or the statements by cabinet ministers or the coalition in Israel currently in power. So that's why a few minutes ago I was saying that I think that this is much more sensitive and it's more felt, more acutely felt by internal forces in Israel and those that identify with them. So I think we have, the analysis needs to be much more fine-tuned. But your question touches all of us, of course. It's food for thought. So if I say that ever since the 1950s we've had this accusation, and if we're mindful of the fact that the conflict between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over time has always had ups and downs in terms of expression of sentiment, and I've seen this through my work and through research. I also believe that the situation now is more acute than at different points in time. Sergio, go ahead. I just have a short comment to make. I believe everything that was said here is true, but the point of order involving Zionism equals racism was used at a time where Yitzhak Rabin was Prime Minister of Israel. He wasn't fascist. He had a coalition of a different nature. So I do not think that there's a clear link, an immediate link between the type of government in power in Israel and this discourse, but rather there is an overarching discourse which is expressed following trends, pressures, and circumstances that change. But the main and fundamental component is denial, denying, and that's what needs to be understood. If I may add something to what Sergio said. Judith? Judith, can you hear me? Yes, go ahead.
Ay, sí, perdón.
I'm right here.
No, quiero agregar algo.
If I may, I'd like to add something.
Sergio de la Pérgola,
I agree
en el
with
sentido
Sergio de
de
la
que
Pérgola
es verdad
in
que
that
eso
it's
ocurrió en el
true
75
that
y
this
eso fue
happened in
resultado también por
1975
resource mobilization.
as a
Fue
result, and
resultado
going back
también
to
del
resource
el
mobilization,
embargo del
it
petróleo
had
que
to
hubo
do
en aquel
with the
momento,
oil
que
embargo in
hubo
place at the
hasta
time,
países que eran amigos
where
se
friendly
abstuvieron o
countries
votaron a
even
favor de la
abstained
resolución.
or
Por eso
voted
digo que es muy
for the
importante y
resolution.
ayudaron también a
And that's
crear ese
what is very
hegemonía, porque de
important. And
hecho
they
Judy nos
helped
está
create
hablando
this
de
hegemony,
cómo ese
because
antisionismo se volvió tan
Judy is talking
hegemónico
about
por la
how
cantidad de, digamos,
anti-Zionism
factores que contribuyeron a
became a
esto.
hegemony thanks to all of these factors that
Recuerdo
fed
otro
into this
caso más,
process. There's
la
another
segunda
case that
intifada,
comes to mind,
también
the Second
generó
Intifada,
simpatía.
which also
Ocurrió 2
led
meses
to
después de que
a great
Barak
deal of sympathy,
le
happened
dio
2
una
months
concesión
after
impresionante a
Barak
los
made
palestinos, y los
major
palestinos rechazaron
concessions
Camp
to
David.
the
Y ahí hubo una
Palestinians, and they
intifada que de repente
rejected it at
o sea,
Camp David.
hirió de
And
muerte el
that
proceso de
led
Oslo.
to a Second
Y yo
Intifada that
recuerdo
was the
como el día
death
de hoy,
blow
como Jacques
to
Chirac,
the
en aquel
Oslo
momento
process.
el
And back then, Jacques
presidente de
Chirac, and I
Francia,
remember this clearly, the
maltrató a
French
Ehud Barak.
president mistreated Ehud
Maltrató a
Barak.
Ehud Barak
He mistreated him
como si él hubiese sido
as if
culpable de esta
he
segunda
had been to
intifada.
blame for the Second Intifada.
O sea que sí, yo creo
So
que no importa
yes,
quién
I
esté en
do
el
believe that
gobierno,
regardless of
es verdad
who
que
is
Netanyahu quizás
in
no manejó
power,
las
of
relaciones
course, Netanyahu
públicas
may
de la
not
mejor
have
forma posible.
handled public
Quizá
relations in the
eso
best
haya
way
contribuido
possible,
algún
and
granito
they
de
may
arena a
have
esto, pero
contributed
no me parece que
somewhat
esto
to the
sería
situation. But
prudente
I
para
don't
nada.
think things would
Es
have
algo que ya
changed
está en la
at
mente
all.
de la
It's
gente,
something
pensar
that
que
is
el culpable es
already
Israel.
engraved in people's minds,
Y
thinking
por
of
eso vemos
Israel
tantas
as the guilty party.
cosas, o
And
sea,
that's
todo
why
lo que tú describiste de lo que está pasando
everything that you said
en
about what is going
en
on
las redes sociales,
on
o sea,
social
esto
media,
tiene legitimidad y esta vez la
this
legitimidad
has
se la dieron
legitimacy, and the
también
legitimacy
países
was also
democráticos
given by
como
democratic nations,
los países europeos,
such as European
Canadá y
countries,
Australia.
Canada,
En el momento
Australia.
que ellos decidieron
As soon as
tomar
they decided
sanciones
to
contra Israel,
adopt sanctions
¿verdad?
against
Como por
Israel,
ejemplo,
they
incluso
did that.
sanciones simbólicas,
And I'm
como
talking about even
no proveer
symbolic
más armas, no
sanctions,
depender
such
de
as
la
not
Australia.
selling more arms to them, although
Es un mensaje que en
Israel does
realidad
not depend on Canada or Australia for that,
confirma
is a
la
message
hostilidad de todos
that
estos
confirms
antisionistas. Lamentablemente,
that
los
hostility.
países
It gives
democráticos del mundo,
legitimacy
Occidente
to
nos
all of these
traicionó pese a que
anti-Zionists.
nosotros seguimos
The
siendo
West
leales
betrayed
a
us in
Occidente
spite of
pese a
our
Occidente. O sea,
continuous
aquí hubo
loyalty
cosas que
to the
fueron mucho
West in
más
spite of the
serias.
West. So there have been things that
Y en mi
were
opinión
much more
también
serious that took place
jugaron
here,
del
and in
lado
my
de Hamas.
opinion, did play
¿Y por
into
qué digo
Hamas's
eso? Porque
hands.
Hamas
And
hizo el
I'm
ataque del 7
saying
de
this
octubre
because Hamas
sabiendo cuál iba a ser la
carried
reacción de
out the
Occidente,
October 7th attack,
sabiendo, porque a la
knowing
larga lo que ellos
how the
quieren es
West
que la
would
relación
react. Because in the
Estados
long run,
Unidos-Israel se
what they
rompa.
want
Y
is
vamos a
for
decir la verdad,
relations to be
Hamas
severed
tuvo
between the
cierto
United States and
éxito,
Israel.
porque dentro
And
de los
let's
27
speak the truth,
senadores
because
demócratas que
Hamas
votaron
was
a
successful.
favor
There
de
were
cortar el
27 senators,
suministro de
Democratic
armas a
senators,
Israel.
who voted for
O sea,
the
aquí también
interruption
los
of arms
políticos,
supply to Israel.
los líderes
So
de Canadá, de
politicians,
Australia, de
leaders in
Francia, de
Canada,
Inglaterra son todos responsables
Australia,
también.
France, and England are all responsible for this as well.
Bueno,
All right.
yo quiero decir que
I
me
would
parece
like to say
muy
that
interesante. Noah,
all that is being said is very interesting. Noah, if I may, we need a few more minutes.
Mira, yo quisiera decir algo ahí.
Let me say something. There's an interesting comment.
No sé quién lo dijo.
I don't know who it
Pero
came
dijo
from,
que si habría algo
but
que,
it was said that
que el gobierno de
if there
Israel
was
no
something
sabe hacer,
that, if there's something that the Israeli
es
government does not know how to do, it is
la
to handle
información y
information
combatir las
and
campañas de
fight
desinformación.
disinformation campaigns.
El gobierno ha tenido redes que no han manejado
The
esta lucha
government
contra la
has not been
desinformación.
able to handle the fight
Bueno, sí, es
and,
cierto.
and wage a fight
Tampoco ha
against
utilizado
disinformation and
aquellas
misinformation.
voces
And
que
that's
pueden,
true. And they
por
have not
ejemplo,
used
apoyar,
those voices that can
un tipo de
actually
campaña que
support
compense.
a campaign
Yo me
to compensate
inclino
for this.
en este momento
I
a señalar que en efecto, cada vez que ha
am
habido
leaning
los
towards
altibajos
saying
del
that every
conflicto
time there's an
palestino-israelí
up and down
han marcado ápices
in
precisamente
the
de
Israeli-Palestinian conflict,
posturas muy
we have
fuertes,
seen also peaks
críticas
in
anti-israelíes y
very harsh
antisionistas.
criticism
Eso es
of
cierto.
Israel
Lo que hoy
and
tenemos
Zionism.
tal vez
That's true.
nuevo por la
And so
respuesta del
anti-Zionism
gobierno,
and
un poco regresando a lo
anti-Israelism.
que señalaba
But
Perla,
what is
es
new, and going back to what Perla
las
was saying,
voces judías que
is
están en
Jewish
este momento
voices
sumándose al
who are
campo
now
crítico. Ahí
joining
sí tendríamos que ver
that critical
hasta
camp.
dónde habría una mayor
So we'd have to see
relación,
to what
Sergio,
extent there's
que
more
la
of
que
a
podemos ver
relationship
en
here,
otros
Sergio, than
niveles.
what we see at at other levels.
Bueno,
So
tenemos una limitación de
we do
tiempo
not have any more time left,
vamos a tener que acercarnos
and we will
dentro
have
de 2
to wrap
semanas
up.
tenemos un
2
nuevo
weeks from
encuentro
now,
donde
we will be
esta
meeting
vez Luis va
again,
a tener
and Luis will be our
la sesión, mientras
speaker,
creo que también estaremos en la
and
posibilidad de
we will
convocar a más
also
colegas.
hopefully be
Teníamos
able
muchos
to invite
registrados,
more
muchos
colleagues. We
más de
had
lo que
very
pensábamos,
many
pero
people
sabemos que
who
estos
signed up,
programas
but we
son
know that
grabados
these
y mucha gente
meetings are
opta
recorded,
por
and many people prefer to
oírlos
just
grabados,
watch the
¿correcto? Y
recording
no en el horario
instead
habitual
of
de
attending
transmisión.
live.
Pues yo quiero agradecerles a
So
todos
I'd like to thank
quienes
all
nos
of you
acompañaron hoy,
who joined
a
us today.
nuestra
I'd
querida
like to thank
intérprete
our
Sharona.
dear interpreter,
Espero no
Sharona.
haberle dado.
I
¿Dónde
hope
está Sharona? Por si
and will
podemos
you turn on
verte.
your camera, please?
A ver, aquí está Sharona.
There
Mil
she is.
gracias.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank Noah for his support on behalf of ISGAP, and all of you for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to see you all. And greetings to all, and all my love to everyone. See you in 2 weeks.